to On the Silk
Hello.
Road with June Cashmere. I'm Amy Swanson, the director of June Cashmere Yarn, and I'm coming to you from Columbus, Ohio. And our guest for our series, this is just our second episode. Hi, is Francoise Danoy from currently San Antonio, Texas. And Francoise is a longtime sort of friend of June Cashmere way early on when Sai
Yes.
Popovic, the founder, was doing more of this part. Now Sai does all things Kyrgyzstan. So we're going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about the work that you do in knitting. We're going to talk about the culture you represent, and I'm just really excited because that's what this series is about, and seeing how culture and heritage interact in people's design work and in their making. So anyway, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this podcast. I was really happy that you reached out to me because yes, I've had me and Sai have had a bit of like a business relationship like back in 2017, 2018 when I was still living in Japan. Yeah, so it's actually nice to be able to catch up and see what's happened on your end as well, just to see how things have evolved and yeah.
COVID.
Yeah, COVID, right? Yeah. So I guess I'll introduce myself really briefly. So as you mentioned, my name is Francoise. I am a knitwear designer and design coach behind the brand Aroha Knits. I started my career as a knitwear designer when I was living in Japan, and that's where I lived for about 6-7 years. And then about 2 years ago, me and my former husband moved to San Antonio, Texas. And that's where I've been for the past 2 years, although my long-term goals is essentially to move back to Australia within like the next 3 to 5 years. So I'll probably be country hopping at some point again.
Oh my goodness, that's what I notice and am like so interested in is you have lived in so many places. And first of all, you have the Maori culture. Do I say that correctly?
Maori.
Okay. Yeah. And so there's that, and I know that influences what you do, but you also have lived in all these places, and I'm just really curious about, and when you learn to knit, and then the whole Japanese knitting scene that is just so unique. I'm just really curious about all of that. So why don't we start with, like, were you born in Australia?
Yeah, so I was born in Australia. Me and my siblings were all born there. When I was about 6 years old, that's when we moved to the United States. We first started in upstate New York and then moved down to Austin, Texas when I was about 8. And that's where I would say like I grew up a majority of the time. But then when I was about 14 years old, I lived in France for a couple of years. It was just a way for me to be more in connect to my father's roots, essentially, because my father's French, my mother's Maori. So that's basically where all that comes from. So I spent a couple years in France. That was a really eye-opening and really good experience. So I am able to speak French fluently, thanks to that experience. And then after I graduated high school, went to school in Georgia, did a semester studying abroad in Japan and France. And then after I graduated college, me and my, like I mentioned, my former husband, we moved to Japan right after graduating because it was kind of like our dream to live in Japan for a while. So yeah, and then also that's where I learned how to knit. Wow. That's also kind of like a bit of an interesting story. So maybe I'll go backtrack a little bit. So after I graduated college, I got a job teaching English in Japan, but it was with a Japanese company. And at that time, I wasn't a US citizen. I just had a green card. So the American government wasn't too happy with me leaving the country and being away for extended periods of time. So they basically said, we will take away your green card unless you apply for citizenship to handle all that. So quit my job, moved back to the States and applied for citizenship. And so that was about an 8-month process. And so during that time, since I had nothing else to do, I saw my mom knitting one day. She had just picked it up like after seeing the second Hunger Games movie. She wanted to teach herself how to knit because the main character was wearing this really interesting snud cowl type of thing that was in this really chunky yarn that was knit. And she was like, I want to knit that. So she started teaching herself how to knit. I saw her knitting, and I thought to myself, that looks really fun. So I think it was January 2000, was it 2013? Was it 2014? I think it was 2014. I set my New Year's resolution that I was going to learn how to knit. And immediately it was like love at first stitch, and I just got completely obsessed with it. And when I moved to Japan, like a few months afterwards, after getting my citizenship, I couldn't work during that time because where we were living was in a tiny village in the middle of nowhere in the Japanese mountains. And essentially, my husband had taken the only job that was available for foreigners at the time, teaching English. So I was like, well, I guess I just learned how to knit and I like to design. So I'll just start up my own business in knitwear design, even though I really don't know anything about running a business. So really how to, like, I only knew how to like knit and purl, maybe do some lace stitches, and designing, that was completely new as well. But I was determined to make this work somehow. So yeah. Yeah, so somehow I managed to make it all work. So yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Is there a bird?
Yes, I've got 2 lovebirds in the background.
Oh,
And then somewhere there's my cat who's hiding around in here. So yeah, I've got some animals living with me.
for a minute I thought, oh, do we have a technical glitch? And I'm like, no, that's birds.
Yeah, one of
Awesome.
them is like having his dinner right now, and the other one is serenading him while that happens. So that's what happens.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask my husband to serenade me when I eat.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so very cool. So now tell me about the influence of your Maori culture.
So actually, this happened when I was working on my the very first project, the very first knitting thing that I ever did. My mom was teaching me the basic stitch. It was just a pink cow that was knit in the round, in chunky yarn and stockinette. And as I was practicing the stitches, this image just came into my mind of me working up a color work piece with traditional Maori motifs. And that was really striking to me because I knew nothing about color work. And I also didn't know anything about what these motifs meant, or like if they even were traditional motifs. But that started the spark in my mind to kind of use knitting as a way to connect to my cultural roots. Like I mentioned, like I was more connected to my French side of the family growing up. I'm not sure, maybe we could go into this whole discussion about like the reason why my parents wanted us to learn French was because it was, more opportunities for jobs and, more culturally relevant, and all that stuff. And so up until that point, I was about 20. I really didn't know anything about my cultural roots on my mother's side. Like I grew up knowing that I was Maori. And like I would get a lot of comments from people asking like, oh, where are you from? And I would say like, oh, I'm French. And then there'll always be like this slight hesitation, or like just slight pause as they just waited for me to give more information because don't really, so, being a foreigner and not being exactly white, they're just waiting for like that whole like, where are you really from type of question. And then sometimes when I would say I am Maori, they'd be like, oh, what's that? And for me, I would be like, actually, I don't know. Like, I don't know anything about my own culture. Like the images that I grew up were very stereotypical images that weren't the most flattering, I would say. Just like very like, old school type of a representation or something like that. So knitting became my gateway to learn more about my culture, learning more about where I came from. And I use knitwear design as kind of a way to document that journey. So like in the beginning, like in 2014, like the first few patterns that I released were both very simple in terms of the design aesthetic and also simple in terms of the stories that I was sharing. But then over the years, as both my designing sensibilities got stronger and I became a better knitter, and I started learning more about who I was and where I come from, then my stories and designs also became more sophisticated.
Yeah. Did you knit what you have on?
No, this one, unfortunately not. I wish I could say that I knit this, but no, I bought this when I was at a Christmas fair in Japan from a alpaca, from a man who comes from Peru. He had a whole bunch of alpacas and he has a whole bunch of like machine knit
I see
things.
yeah.
But I was just like, oh, it's so warm. I love it.
Very cool. Well, so then because you were growing up and spending so much time in the South, I wonder if people would, when you said that, they wondered where you were from. Did they often think you were from a Latin American country? Yeah,
Yeah,
I bet.
all the time, all the time.
Yeah.
No,
So educate us on, so you didn't know about your mother's culture. So I know that I don't know much of anything. The only thing I really know about it is what I have observed through you and what
mhm.
you post and share. So why don't you tell us about your Maori culture?
I was just like, I guess where do I even start? But
Yeah, right.
so I guess first of all, where do we come from? So the Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. Um, the English, I guess we were colonized in what, the 1800s. And that definitely has had an effect on our culture. Like my grandfather would often tell us stories, and the few times when I was able to see him, like of him being beaten in school for speaking our his native language. And that was actually kind of one of the reasons why, my mom didn't really want us to didn't we focused more on the French side because of her own experiences of racism in New Zealand. She didn't want that for her children, so she tried to protect us from that by focusing on the other aspects of our culture, of the cultural influences that we had growing up. But it is what's happening in New Zealand right now. I think for like the past 2 decades, there's definitely been a strong revitalization of the culture, and the efforts to preserve the language, to bring it back into schools, and then other cultural practices such as tattooing, which I could talk a little bit in a bit later. But the ta moko, with the for the women, the moko kowai, the facial tattoos for both men and women, those are seeing a big resurgence. Um, I think the most common, what's the word, entry point that people have when it comes to Maori in New Zealand is the All Blacks haka. So it's if you watch rugby and the All Blacks are playing, they usually do a dance or a chant or slash dance right before they do their before they play. It's a way to intimidate the opposing team.
Oh,
So that's yeah. So usually that's like most people's like entry point to how they of their introduction to Maori culture, but it definitely is a lot more. There's so much more to that for sure. For me, I've just been learning, in addition to learning different fiber arts, I've also been trying to learn more traditional arts as well, such as weaving and other things like that. I've recently, I guess a couple years ago, these birds.
they're like,
Yeah, they're going for it.
one of them's really sending love.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure what's going on. But a few years ago, actually it was during the pandemic when I was living in Japan. I had the opportunity to take language classes with a company called Learn Maori Abroad, because I was like, oh, I'm a Maori, I'm abroad. This is perfect for me.
Oh, cool.
So I was a student, and then I was able to become an assistant, and then I started teaching the beginner level classes. Not long after that, I'm currently on hiatus from teaching, but being able to find community with other Maori has definitely been a really big part in feeling more confident in my own identity as a Maori, as someone who grew up outside of New Zealand, also was born outside of New Zealand as well. There's definitely a lot of for other Maori like myself who are in similar situations, we often feel like a sense of not shame, but definitely some sort of like weird feelings around like, can we even call ourselves Maori because we weren't born there? But then we realized that even people born in New Zealand also kind of have the same feelings, like, are we even Maori enough and stuff like, because of the effects of colonization, they're being displaced from their culture. So yeah, so I kind of that's why I use knitting, just to help me connect to that, and being able to connect to other Maori and listening to their stories has been really beneficial and healing, I guess, for my own journey. But yeah. Let me see, anything else? Oh yeah, so maybe another important point. So the Maori, the name or the word Maori is actually not the original name for our people. Before that, we refer to ourselves as Tangata Whenua, or people of the land, or more specifically, we would refer to ourselves by tribal affiliations. When the British came in, we started calling ourselves Maori. Maori actually just means like normal or ordinary, or original, because we were the original people here. But really, there are many different tribes and many different sub-tribes within New Zealand, and each of these different tribes sometimes usually have like some slight differences in dialect or cultural customs. So the tribe that I mostly affiliate to is Nachapado, which is one of the larger tribes on the East Coast. We definitely have some interesting dialect. What's the word? I don't want to say dialect choices, but our dialect is certainly very interesting and unique to us. That I'm still learning. But each tribe is going to be slightly different, just based on where they are.
And are you still able to understand each other?
Yes, sometimes you might have to be aware of the other tribes, like dialects and customs and their traditions, because it could be just sort of the way they might pronounce things a little bit differently, or they might have slightly different grammar rules. So it's just little small things. So, but I think for the most part, you'll be able to understand.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And so, what are some of the things that you've knit that kind of represent where you've integrated the Maori culture?
I would say a good majority of my designs have incorporated the Maori culture in one way or another. My signature as a designer, I like to design two things mostly, either lace shawls or color work pieces, where it's like a color work sweater or color work towel. With the lace pieces that I do, that's more of like an abstract representation. So I think of the story that I want to tell through my work, and then I find a lace pattern that best represents that story and incorporates it into there. With my color work piece, it's a little bit more straightforward because I like to translate.
That I think they would rather talk about their culture.
Yeah, seriously. Like, what's going on? If they get a little bit too noisy, I can cover
that's okay. You probably don't dare move your camera setup, but maybe you want to see these birds.
Yeah, maybe afterwards I could bring the camera over just to see, like,
yeah, we can do it at the end.
I didn't bring any of my pieces with me. They've just been hiding all over the place. But like for my color work pieces, since a lot of the motifs that I first drew inspiration for, they're quite geometric in nature, it was quite easy to translate that into a colorwork piece. A lot of my colorwork pieces are very geometric as well, especially like my cows. So that's also another way that I represent my culture in there. I've also, over the past few years, I have started to branch out and try to explore other art forms in Maori culture and incorporating that into my work. Whether if it's like traditional weaving methods, so I try to replicate those same weaving stitches into my knitting.
So is this textile weaving, or like with grass fibers and baskets, or is it textile?
Like like a bit like the baskets and things like that,
okay.
And for like quilts and stuff like that. Yeah, actually, I have a workshop where I actually talk about how I incorporate my heritage into my work.
I think you had one. I think I saw it on the Canada event.
Knit City, yeah.
Knit City, yeah.
Yeah. So when that one, I actually have like photos and a whole presentation for that. But I'm always, if you just take a look at my Ravelry library, I'm always trying to find new ways to explore within knitting, how to translate these different art forms into knit stitches. Although recently I've started branching out to other types of fiber art to also explore that there as well. I've also done natural dyeing, so being able to work directly with plants, I think, has also been really interesting. And like super recently, as in just this past weekend, I picked up punch needling, and already I was just like, already I'm.
Oh yes! Wow.
Yeah, so I had that.
Oh, that's really fun.
Yeah, so I have a piece in my room. It's a crochet mask. Oh man, I'm gonna go grab it. It's really cool. It's
okay,
really cool.
While you're doing that, I'm gonna also get my screen ready to share your pieces on Ravelry.
Yeah. Yeah. So this one is not mine. This is from a duo who live in New Zealand. The names are Lissy and Rudy. Lissy Cole and her husband Rudy. So they are crochet fiber artists. And so they do really cool pieces like this. Like you see these colors, and so these are traditional masks. Well, I guess this is not a traditional since it's crochet, but it's based off traditional carvings that they translate into crochet pieces. And so that really inspired me. I've tried to do some form of it, and knitting didn't really work out so much. So this past weekend, I was inspired to try and give it another go
Oh my
with
gosh,
French
and
needle.
just in the weekend. Well, what a fun way now to like transfer those kinds of forms.
Yes, I'm always trying to find ways to do that. They're currently working on a really big project of essentially doing crocheting an entire like house-like structure. And they've invited several artists from around the world to help decorate the walls for the paneling. And for the longest time, I was stuck on what I wanted to do because I was like, I didn't know how I'm going to represent this with knitting. And then when punch needle came along, I was like, I know exactly what I'm going to do. And like, I've got my first panel like on the frame, on the grid, just ready to go. And I was like, yes. So it feels really good to feel that inspiration for sure. So yeah, so I'm always finding new things to get really sucked into and to explore.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah.
I don't know how this is going to look with the recording. So I'm sorry when we're but I guess it'd be the same thing if we're watching live. So I want to share the screen, and here we go. Here's Ravelry share. So this is the first one I have pulled up, and you go ahead and pronounce how it's said.
Yeah, so this is the Kakakirehe shawl. Oh boy, that was I'm going to try it again. Kakakirehe shawl. So that I believe that was in reference to like animal fibers. And that's
yes, I read that. Right, because June in June Cashmere, and I should say this was, so we're gonna backtrack a little bit too. So we mentioned earlier on that you and Sai had known each other. I actually don't know how that how you two met, but our photographs of our yarn are, you've taken those for us. So that was one of the collaborations, but how did you and Sai meet?
How did we meet? That is a good question. I remember he came to Japan, to Osaka at one point, and came to the yarn store that I would frequent often. And I don't know if it's that we met there for the first time or if I'd already known him at that point, and it was just by perchance that I was able to meet him in person. And I didn't realize that it was in 2016. Like, I had only been a designer for a couple of years at that point, so I was still relatively new. So, or did I meet him at TNNA, which is the needle?
Well, the first year he went there was 2017.
Gotcha.
And I think you met him before that.
Yeah.
But
I think I might have met up. Yeah.
So it was through the yarn shop and him that then you did a couple of pieces out of our yarn, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. And so this is one of them, the shawl. And so talk about, this has this really unique, well, what the back, if you saw the back of this, it would just be slate, right? So the colors here are slate and scarlet.
Yes. Yeah, so this is with a mosaic slip stitch pattern for the motifs right there. For me, I was just, at that point, I was just exploring different types of stitches on a shawl, on the shawl shapes. And actually, it was really, I remember like really enjoying working with the yarn. It was just really soft. It was really silky. So I just wanted something simple to go with the yarns to really like let the elegance of the yarn shine through. I can't remember where I got that particular stitch pattern. I think I found it on Pinterest or something, but yeah, it was a really beautiful pattern.
That is a beautiful pattern, and it's still available on Ravelry. Yes. And it takes just 3 skeins of yarn, 2 of one color and 1 of the other. So 2 of the slate in this case and 1 of the scarlet. And I love the tassels.
Yes, that was one of my favorite details for that.
Very cool. So just, I'll go back, and so if you search Ravelry, you can search either by your name,
my name, yeah,
or by the shawl name. And then there's another one you did that is is also kind of borrows on the same theme. And this is a great little key. And this one was called, I forget, Connected.
Yeah, Connected. There's a Connected top. So during that time, I was playing around with doing like a quarterly subscription magazine where I would release a bunch of patterns at once around a theme. And I believe the theme for this one was for self exploration, or challenging oneself, or exploring other cultures through knitting. And of course, this was like definitely like the highlight of a lot of my incorporating a lot of my culture into the patterns. So the motif on there is the niho niho, or the shark tooth
Oh, wow.
pattern. So I was just playing, also was playing around with intarsia, found out really quickly that's actually not my favorite form of color work, but it does make for a really cute design.
Oh, cool. So this is intarsia. And then the other technique lays, it is a cable type slip stitch that lays on top, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, that is so intriguing.
Definitely,
Cool.
it looks difficult, but it's a lot easier than it looks for sure.
And the intarsia is lovely. And then there, I know there's a little picture. Oh, I gotta shut that picture. There's a little picture that shows
I think the back as well.
the back. Yes, is that adorable? That's really sweet. That also only takes 3 skeins of fingering.
Yep.
Very fun. Are there any others that you want to pull up here of your patterns that maybe show more of your cultural?
Yeah, maybe if you go to my name, Francoise Danoy, when you can scroll through to take a look to see what else I got there. I believe that's. So let's see. Actually, a lot of these.
Scroll and you tell me.
Basically, all of these patterns. I mean, they're all representations right there. Let's see. Yeah, so that one is a bit of a wave. Actually, go back. I want to highlight one particular pattern. So it's the Once Were Weavers shawl. So yeah, so let's see.
Once Were Weavers.
Yes, that one.
Okay.
So that one was definitely a pattern that I drew heavy influence from weaving patterns. So creating a cross stitch in there, incorporating the lace pattern, which looks like feathers. Yeah, that one was a lot of fun.
One that shows a lot of it.
Yeah, so those stitches in there, it was a direct inspiration from traditional weaving techniques.
There we go. Oh, wow. So, oh, wow. So kinds of motifs you would see on those baskets. Yes, I see the feather. Yeah. You said feather.
Yep.
Beautiful. Very beautiful. Cool. So let's see. Have any of the old, so does any of your, I'll stop sharing this screen. Stop share and we'll go back to full. There we go. Any of the other places? So were there techniques in Japan, now that you've knit learned in Japan and then you came to the US, there have to be knitting differences? Any observations or not?
I guess a little bit. Well, first of all, from what I've known, just from my limited experience from knitting Japanese patterns, is that Japanese patterns are very much different, written differently from a pattern that you would find on Ravelry or for like an international audience. Japanese patterns are more like a schematic and very basic instructions, and usually for garments, it's only written up in one size.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so yeah, that's definitely a particular feature of Japanese patterns. Most people around the world know Japanese name from like the Japanese stitch dictionaries. Yeah. The stitch patterns there are very intricate, very detailed, and very textured base. It definitely takes a moment to get used to be able to read the charts and get used to it, because sometimes they don't follow like a particular rhythm like we might see with other lace patterns. But it's definitely well worth the effort to spend the time working up those
books.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
But I'm curious then about, because not everybody is going to fit in one size. So then do knitters just intuitively there know how to change for themselves, or what happens?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, people in Japan usually are quite smaller than they are in the US, so it is a little bit more uniform in size. But yeah, I do know for some people who may not fit into their sizes that they can feel excluded from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then, so your French background, is that sneaking in at all in what you're doing, or?
I might have once, maybe one or two times. I've done a pattern called Fields of Lavender, which is a reference to the lavender fields in France. But
Oh,
apart from that,
yeah.
I really haven't done it so much. For me, mainly the main reason, my justification for that is there's already plenty. I mean,
Yeah.
French culture is not in danger of, or never was in danger of being eradicated, and
Right.
so I'm just like, and I've already, and I grew up feeling pretty connected to my to my French side, so I never felt that urge or desire to be like, oh, where do I come from on that part? It's like, I already know.
I get it. I get it. I
Yeah.
get it. So I don't know if people, I first saw the tattooing, you mentioned that earlier, on your Instagram posts, and this was
Mhm.
a long time ago. And of course, I didn't know anything about that, and I know people don't know about that. But you would stencil
Yes.
tattoo, but so I don't know. You talk about that. You share.
Yes. And so I don't know when I did. I think it was in 2018. I was able to get access to shoot the stencils for the tattoos. So for women, the tattoo is called the moko kowai, which is a tattoo right on the chin. It is a sacred tattoo that back in the day, we would have we would get quite, I don't want to say quite regularly, but it was just normal part of the culture. And then when colonization came in, I mean, there was definitely a big effort to erase that, because obviously you don't want to have any representation of your culture or anything like that when you're trying to assimilate.
Right.
But it's definitely gotten a huge resurgence in the past decade, 2 decades or so. So you're seeing it more and more with young people today, but also like older people as well. And so with me, I use the stencil as like a direct representation of my culture. So when you see it, you definitely know that, I am representing my culture. So it's definitely meant to be like a very strong visual representation within the knitting industry.
Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So but you hope to go back to Australia. So is there a large population that also emigrated to Australia? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a decent sized population of Maori who live in Australia, and I know some Maori down there who also have the moko kowai there as well. And I know one of my friends who lives in Japan also recently received the moko kowai. So it's definitely, and I know a couple people. I know one woman here who has it in the United States, and even within San Antonio, even though he wasn't Maori, it was just randomly at a restaurant with the server. He had his own traditional facial tattoo.
Wow.
And so when I saw that, I was like, you know what, I think I just need to go. And because there's definitely that hesitation of just like, oh, what do you do with a facial tattoo, especially not in New Zealand. It's like, but at that point I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna screw what everybody else thinks.
Yeah, you have to be you.
Yeah.
Well, that's very exciting. So you said you're taking a little bit of a break from what?
Teaching teaching language classes that I mentioned earlier. And I also did take a bit of a break from designing over the past year. As my husband and I were going through a separation. That was a pretty difficult time. So I wasn't really quite didn't have quite any of the energy to devote to designing or anything like that. But just very recently, I've just felt this like grand spurt of energy just to get back into creating and exploring different art forms, and back into doing teaching and workshops and all that. So yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm sorry about the hard time, and I'm glad for the. I was just reading another post by somebody who was by Gigi Made It.
Yeah.
And she was going through a hard time and couldn't knit, and then now she's returning to knitting, and so you can understand the depth of when knitting is your thing, right? And the depth of the personal pain you go through, not having the energy for the thing you love. It's a hard
time. It was definitely really weird to be going through that time, because I was so disconnected from my knitting. It was just like I just felt like I lost a part of me when I wasn't able to knit, because that was what I'd been doing for the past 8 years for so long. So it is really nice to be able to get back into that and then discover new forms of self-expression.
And come with different energy, and maybe use it for healing and growth, and the things we do with with our making.
Yes.
So, very cool. Well, do you have any classes coming up or things that you're offering continuously, or
So
your patterns? You have lots of patterns on Ravelry, and
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, so I have my patterns on sale for Ravelry. I offer a pay what works model, because there's often quite lots of talks about both charging for designers, charging what they're worth, but then also financial accessibility. So for me, I offer a pay what works model, so that way people can choose how much they want to opt in to pay for my patterns. Like I also teach knitwear design, so I have a course called the Swatch Studio Circle that I offer on a rolling basis, that people can sign up for if they want to learn how to get into knitwear design. So they have access to me as their coach to help them with that. I am going to be teaching some workshops, but there's no details have been finalized yet, so I can't say exactly. I would just say maybe follow my Instagram or sign up for my newsletter for news about that.
And what's your Instagram handle?
So my Instagram handle is Aroha Knits. So
that's right.
Aroha Knits. I'll just write it in the chat or something.
Good job. Yeah.
So you can find me everywhere online underneath that handle. You can just use that to follow along and see what I'm doing. I do know that I'm going to New Zealand in November.
Wow.
I need to teach some workshops in Auckland during my first weekend there. They decided to fight. They're having a full-on fight in the cage right now. Like,
oh no!
Bloody.
Just a minute, they'll get their cameo.
You two, Anyway, let me see what else. I mean, I think just staying. I'm actually like posting on Instagram more now, so I'm actually going to probably have updates there. But also my newsletter is a really good place to stay up to date of anything that's coming up. Because I do know that I'm going to be teaching some online workshops and then also traveling to teach some workshops, but they still are in the process, so nothing like formalized yet. But yeah, I do have quite some exciting things coming up for sure.
That's exciting. Yeah. So follow Aroha Knits, and I don't think I'm getting your newsletter, so I'm going to sign up for that. And
they get sent out every Friday morning.
Awesome. And maybe you and I can talk about a new collaboration.
I think it's like way overdue. Yes, we need to do something. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been very fun. And
thank you for having me. Like, I really enjoyed this chat.
Cool.